I mean, when I was in London doing my PhD, the idea that governed a lot of the idea that was governing a lot of the work that we were creating at that time was this idea called the production of nature, which was developed by this Marxist geographer named Neil Smith, who actually spent a large part of his career here in New York City and teaching at the City College. Very influential person who died, I think, about 15 years ago. I'm not quite sure on that. I have to look that up. Anyway, very influential person. And his argument was that in the era of capitalism and industrialization, that every aspect of the natural world has been reworked by human beings. So arguing for naturalism is in some ways a mistake because the nature that surrounds us, that we imagine as being external to us, is something that we've created. A great example of that was an article that was in the papers just last week about how the removal of so much groundwater out of farmlands in the US, as well as glacial melting due to climate change, is actually shifting the axis of the Earth slightly. You know, that the North Pole has actually shifted several miles in one direction or another. Anyway, the larger point is that our impact on the natural world is so extensive and extreme that it even is affecting like the axis of the Earth.
Yeah.
So an idea like that makes it very hard to be a quote unquote naturalist, because naturalism argues that there's this thing, nature, that's outside of us. And if we can only figure out how to get closer to it, then society would be better. There's a race-based critique of naturalism that argues that the quote unquote laws of nature were ones that are discovered and advanced by like white Europeans who are arguing for what the principles of nature are. So there's like a racial critique that there's many ways to understand nature and from numerous perspectives. There's a decolonial, to use a fashionable term, critique of naturalism that argues that so many of the quote unquote naturalists were colonialists. And that, you know, how do societies that experienced colonialism have differing ideas about nature and structure? So what I think I offer is what I call a disability critique of naturalism, which I mentioned earlier, which is just that all forms of naturalism lean on or rely on the idea that nature is inherently about the capacities of things. And so I argue, like, how can we bring in the idea of incapacity, and what would that mean? I don't know if I have the answer to that, but I can give some examples of people that work with nature and who have introduced ideas about impairment and weakness that I think are very interesting. So here's one. So a lot of people that are that think of themselves as adhering to or have allegiances to a naturalist philosophy often talk about trees and try to mimic or relate to the structure of trees, which they idealize. Trees have very efficient use of physical structure. So for an architect, they're very interesting.
Yep.
They perform all kinds of metabolic functions by converting all kinds of pollutants into the air into less polluting things. One of the chief ones today being turning carbon into oxygen, as I mentioned. They provide shade. Okay. So there's this architecture firm in the Netherlands called West8. They're landscape architects. And they did a very interesting project in Madrid, Spain, which is a city that has a long history of creating these kinds of boulevards that you see all over Europe, in which you see these rows and rows of trees kind of held upright and trimmed to look perfect. So in this project that they did that was completed relatively recently, they went to a nursery or an area where they're growing trees. And there were all these trees that were bent and crooked and kind of deformed. And they were pretty large. They were pine trees that were twisted. And they were deemed unsuitable for urban use because they had such disfigured shapes. And so they would be destroyed by this nursery. So they actually said, we want to use those trees and plant them. It was really interesting. So they selected hundreds, I believe, of these. I saw this project. I'm not sure how many trees it had, but it was many, many trees. Let's say dozens and dozens and dozens of these trees. And they planted them in this park in something kind of like a boulevard. And then because these trees couldn't hold themselves up, they designed these bright red crutches. These things look like crutches to hold them up. And the experience of it is wonderful because for someone like myself, who's used crutches, who's used a wheelchair, walks on artificial limbs now, like just seeing this image of frailty and weakness and disability, very broadly conceived, built into a public urban space was really exciting. And it felt like there was like a kind of place for the way I understand my own body, right? My own nature, so to speak, within and to be reflected into the built environment around me. It was, it's thrilling. Yeah.